Alright, welcome to another tutorial video where we will take a tap light, as you see here, and convert it for switch adapted toys. So we're going to take this Meridian LED tap light. This is something you could find in your local Walmart. It just turns on and off, has a switch inside it. We're going to open this up and actually modify this to be an accessible switch. This accessible switch can be used with our toys and cars that we make, and it can be used in various ways, so it's really versatile. For this tutorial, we're going to be using a Meridian LED tap light. This is something you can find at your local Walmart. And the tools here, we're using the standard Adaptaplay toolkit. Comes with a soldering iron, solder, a drill bits, heat shrink gun, screwdrivers, wire strippers, and wire cutters. Also have a set of helping hands, and you're going to need a audio jack and a switch to actually modify that tap light and some wire. And for this video, I'm using some 18 gauge stereo wire. Alright, we're going to start with the tap light, and there's 4 screws in the back that we need to take out. They're really small, so just make sure you keep up with them as we go through this project. So once the screws are out, you can just take it apart. It should be 3 pieces, and there should be a little piece of paper that's inside this switch. You can pull that off and throw it away. And as you can see, the inside of this switch just has some springs, has a latching switch in there, and you can tell it's latching because when you press it in, it stays in, right? It doesn't come back up. So this is a latching switch right now, so you push it once, it stays on because that switch is stuck on, and then you push it again and it turns off because that switch is stuck in the off position. So it's almost like a light switch. So for this project as well, we're going to need an audio jack. So this should come in your kit. And right here in this video, I have a mono audio jack. And this casing just comes off. It just unscrews. Let me zoom in here. And so what we're going to do with our speaker wire is we're going to solder it to this audio jack. So let's unscrew this here so you can see the inside. And there should be 2 points of contact where we want to solder our wire. You'll see those 2 holes there. That's where we want to solder the speaker wire to. And then we're going to put it back together. So I have my wire and audio jack. Let me zoom in. And I'm going to take my speaker wire. I'm actually going to just pull it apart. It pulls apart pretty easily. And this is the 18 gauge speaker wire. Your speaker wire may be a different thickness. It may look a little different than this, but it is primarily the same. We're going to get our wire strippers and strip the ends on the speaker wire so we can solder it to the audio jack. So just close the wire strippers around the wire, find the right size, and then pull up. And then you should strip off the wire. You should see the stranded copper wire then when you use the wire strippers. I usually strip about, 1/8 inch or so, nothing too excessive, but just enough so you have some wire to work with when you want to thread it through that hole to solder on the audio jack. Something we don't want to forget is heat shrink. We definitely want to use this with the audio jack. So at least make sure that one end has heat shrink on it when we solder this. So now that we've pulled the ends apart and we stripped the ends, I'm just going to slide this heat shrink on top of the wire here and just leave it down below. So after I'm done soldering, I can pull it back up and shrink that heat shrink onto where I soldered the wire. So safety first, please use your safety glasses before you solder, and before you plug in your soldering iron, make sure that the wires are in good condition. Make sure the setting is set to the highest setting. So I'm going to take the soldering iron, I'm going to check the wires here, make sure there's no burn marks. We've had past students use these and maybe they accidentally set the soldering iron on the wire. Any exposed wire can be dangerous, so we want to check that out before plugging it in. And this looks good, so I'm going to plug in this soldering iron, and then there's a little switch on the back. Make sure it's not on the 0, make sure it's on the 1, and it should have a little blinking red light on top to make sure that it's heating up. should have some rosin core solder. Looks like this should be in your toolkit. And while your soldering iron is heating up, it should take about 5 to 10 minutes to heat up really good. You'll see that everything here is hot, so don't touch any of this metal part. And I'm going to touch this solder to the tip of this soldering iron. And the melting temperature of this solder is fairly low compared to other metals, so you're going to see the solder melt on the tip. And what you want when you solder is you want good heat conduction onto your work, and then you want to put solder onto that work to make sure it sticks. So we're going to start setting up our wire with our audio jack, and we're going to take this thick wire, take some of those strands away so we could fit some of the strands through the hole. So I had to remove quite a few of the strands. You'll see them hanging below, and then I put some of the strands through that loop, and I'm going to make a little J hook here. So I'm going to bend it to where it won't come out. So I'm bending that into a J shape through that loop. That way it'll stick there. So I'm gonna touch my soldering iron tip to that, you see, and then touch the solder to it, and then that solder will melt into all the crevices, and it'll make sure that this sticks to the audio jack. And then afterward, I can just cut off those extra strands. I'm now going to put the audio jack, now that is threaded through, onto the helping hands. And I always use both sides because, if you don't secure the back of your wire, it can really just pull it in the wrong direction. And you really want to have your wire straight here because, you're going to thread that casing back up later and screw that back on to the audio jack. So you really want to have that straight. So we had that in the helping hands. I'm going to touch the soldering iron to the work, and then I'm going to take the solder in my other hand, or a partner can do this, help you with this, and melt the solder onto the work. So the trick here is when you touch the soldering iron to the work, you're going to want to give it, a minute maybe, just to get hot. So when you touch the wire is also hot, and then the solder will melt into all those crevices. And then, I can tug on the wire a little bit here, just very lightly, and I can see that solder is now secured, and an electrical signal is now touching both the wire and the audio jack because there's metal now that's through those. And then I will just cut off the extra strands that I don't need. So here's an example of one of our contacts being soldered onto the audio jack. I didn't melt anything, which is good. And then now that it is cool, I can bring up the heat shrink, because if you bring it up while it's still hot, your heat shrink will just shrink while you bring it up, and that's never good. I'm going to set the heat shrink up at the top, plug in my heat gun, turn that on, and then warm up this heat shrink, and it'll shrink around the wire. And this heat shrink is really important. You can heat shrink both wires, but really you just need one, because you don't want the two contacts touching. That's called a short in the wire, right? And if the two contacts are touching, then your switch at the other end's not going to work. And then you're going to have a problem with your audio jack. So we really want to separate the two contacts on this audio jack. And now that I have this heat shrink here, none of that metal is going to touch the bottom. And that's where we're going to put the next wire. We're going to loop it through there and then solder that onto the audio jack. So I again did the same thing. I took away some strands so it fits through the loop. And I'm actually going to do this from the inside out, because again, you have to pull up that casing and screw it on. So I'm going to do that from the inside out. I'm going to pull the wires through, that stranded wire. I'm going to pull down in a J shape, put it on the helping hands, and solder it to the audio jack. So you can see that's outside, or from inside out, excuse me. And then bend that down at that J shape, and then solder that on. Okay, so you can see the work there. We're going to get our solder, and we're going to touch our soldering iron to the work. I'm going to touch that copper wire. I'm going to hold it there for a minute, And you know, the heat's going to conduct into everything. It's going to conduct into our wire, it's going to conduct into the audio jack. So all that metal is hot, so no matter where I touch the solder, it's going to melt. So I'm not really touching the tip of the soldering iron, I'm really touching the work. The soldering iron just conducts heat to the work. So it's getting hot now, I'm kind of holding it there. You know, not too much pressure, so it's pretty tough. And so all that heat's conducting into the work, touching that solder to the work, and it's gonna melt it. It's gonna turn into like a, you know, a water, and you can see that there's a good solder right there. And you can see it's really clear. It melted into all the crevices, and then once it's cool, so it's gonna be hot, so be careful. Once it's cool, I can do a light tug on it, make sure that it's secure, and make sure that, you know, the contacts, the solder is like into all the metal and contacts. So that looks pretty good. Looks like it's secure, and the solder successfully went through, and that heat shrink is really separating those two wires, so they're not gonna overlap or touch, which is great. And then we can pull up our casing, screw that back on, and we're done with that end. So just pull it through the back, pull it up. And it may be a little tricky to, you know, push on, but just lightly push it on. Secure those wires together, pull it up, and screw it on to the audio jack. And that will protect those wires that we soldered to the audio jack. Now I'm going to take the other end and separate those wires. And this is standard speaker wire, right? So always has two ends. And then I'm going to make sure I have some heat shrink on one of those wires, because now we're going to take this end, strip it, and put it on the switch. So again, how much do you strip off? You know, about 1/8 of an inch, just enough to work with so we can wrap it around the ends on the switch, the contacts. We're going to take this LED tap light, and we're going to remove the latching switch that's in there already. So you'll just get your wire strippers or wire cutters. They have wire cutters in the back of the strippers here. So I'm going to take those two wires, cut those, and I'm going to get the new switch. And this switch, it can be a momentary or latching. Again, you'll know if it sticks in or not. And it's going to have 6 pins on the bottom. And I'm going to pull up a diagram on the screen. But we're going to want to cut diagonally, cut 2 pins off of this push button. So with these 6 pins here, again, top left, bottom right, just like we saw in the diagram before, we're going to cut those pins off with our wire cutters. And if you want to, if it makes it easier, you can kind of bend, you can kind of push with your thumb these pins in a certain direction, and just kind of pull them away, just so you can make sure you only cut the right pins. So I'm going to cut these, and now we have 2 pins on either side. We only need 1 set of these, so we're going to wire our 2 wires to 2 of these pins on either side, and then it should work with the push button. So again, these pins are malleable, so I'm just going to make them flat. I'm just going to pull them, push them flat, and you can see that this push button is going to just sit like this in the LED tap light. It's going to sit somewhat flat, and then we're going to solder these 2 wires to those 2 contacts in the front. So you're going to want to take the top of your tap light, and we're going to need to drill a hole so we can route the wire through the tap light to that switch. And we need to do that before we solder anything. So I'm going to line up the 4 holes. There should be 4 holes here, and I'm going to try to think about how I want my wire to route to those contacts through the tap light. So I'm going to choose to go through the side here, and I'm going to drill a hole that's big enough for my thickness of wire. 18 gauge is pretty thick, so I'm going to need a fairly big diameter drill bit. And I'm going to drill out a hole in the side of this tap light. So I found a drill bit that works, or at least visually looks pretty good. I'm going to secure this siding of the tap light on the table. I'm going to drill very slowly at first, just try to start it, and then make a good hole in the side of this tap light. And if there's any plastic, you can just peel that off, and it's a clean hole that we can route our wire through. And now I can push the wires through the hole. If the hole's not big enough, just get a bigger drill bit. I'm going to pull those through, and we'll leave that sitting down. Of course, the shrink wrap needs to come on after. So I'm going to push that back through, then put the heat shrink back on the wire. So since the contacts on this button are malleable, I'm going to kind of, pull them a little bit to the side, make a V shape, so I have more room between the wires to solder, because as you know, if any two contacts are touching that shouldn't be, there's going to be a short in the wire and it's not going to work. So this is what I consider to be the hardest part of this project. It's just securing the wire to those contacts and getting it soldered. And again, if you have a partner, they could help. Just be careful. We don't want anyone to burn themselves. But with the helping hands, it does make it pretty easy. Again, use both sides. Secure one end of the wire on one side. And then what I've done is on one of those contacts, I've wrapped the wire around the contact. So I just wrap the whole thing, and I want to solder this, and this is tricky. I don't want to hold it too long, because if I do, I'll melt the plastic on the button, and I can also melt the wire sheathing as well. So this one's a bit tricky to solder, but again, with your partner, if they can help you do this, I would recommend using a partner for this. So I'm going to touch the end of my soldering iron to the work, and I'm going to try to hold it there, get it a little bit hot enough so I can get my solder on there. This is very, very tricky because I don't want to overheat or burn the plastic on the button, because we can destroy the button. So I think I got a little solder on there, and we'll check it out, see if it looks good. So this isn't too bad. The metal melted into the contact and the wire, which is great. It's secure to the button, and you can see where I accidentally touched the plastic button, so I did melt some of that plastic. But this contact actually looks pretty good. It's going to be secure, and I didn't melt any of the internal parts on this button. So if you have heat shrink, use your heat shrink gun and make sure that contact is separate from the other contact. And then we're going to take our other end of the wire. I'm going to use heat shrink here as well, because I really want to make sure that these two wires on the push button are separate. So I've wrapped it like before, so it's upside down here. I've secured the other end to the helping hands. I'm going to zoom in here. You can see how that copper wire, that stranded wire, is wrapped around the contact on the push button. And then we're going to take our soldering iron, touch the work, get it hot, and then melt in that solder into the contact and to this braided wire, right? And then it's going to melt in there and make a nice firm contact and keep it secure. So you can see by the way I'm soldering this, I'm keeping my soldering gun away from the plastic button, so I'm not melting it or any internal components. And then I'm touching the work, and then it's melting in that solder into the button. Let's see how this looks. A little bubbly, but I think it's going to work. I'm going to tug on that a little bit. It'll seem secure, and I can see that the solder is touching both the copper wire and the contact. And before I do anything else, I can use the tap light tester or a toy. I can plug in the audio jack into the tap light tester, and it came on. So this is either good or bad. If it's a momentary light switch, this is bad. That means there's a problem, because I'm not touching the tap light right now, the tap light button. But this is a latching switch, this blue one here. So I'm just going to press it, unlatch it, it's off. Press it, latch it, it stays on. And so this is a latching switch. And I can see that it works as intended. So we are good to go. We did everything right. I'm going to put the heat shrink on there, and then we can start putting that push button back into the LED tap light. So that looks pretty good. It is separated by the heat shrink, so the two contacts will never touch, which is great because then it won't work if there's a short in the wire. And we know it works as intended because we tested it with the tester before we proceeded on with putting it in the LED tap light. So what we're going to do here, so we have it threaded through the tap light casing. You know, when we put that on, again, we want to think about how that wire is going to route in there when we screw the top back on. So we want it flat in that little spot where the old push button was, and we may need to think about it before we proceed. So I am taking some wire cutters, and I'm actually just getting rid of some of that plastic because, you know, my wires are in the way, because I want that to sit there flat. So I'm going to strip out some of that plastic. It's really easy to do with those wire cutters. And we're going to actually use some hot glue and hot glue that push button in that location so it's secure when we put this thing back together. So I definitely want to be patient and make sure my hot glue gun is quite hot and the glue is coming out really well before proceeding to glue in my button. And it may not work the first try. You know, I think I messed up here on my first attempt to actually glue this thing in there. So feel free to be very liberal with the glue and just put lots in there, make sure it is secure. And it doesn't have to be perfectly flat. You know, it may be a little bit angled, and that's okay. The push button is still going to work. So you can see the push button here. Again, it has a little bit of an angle, and that's all right. I'm going to add some more glue around the sides and the back. And I think that's pretty good. I'm going to let it cool. So again, I'm going to be patient here. And I think patience is the biggest thing with this project. And let that cool so it doesn't go anywhere when I start to put the casing back on. So with the wire routed in there, the button is you know, glued in there now. I'm going to line up the holes again, and you're going to see that here. And I'm going to put those screws back into this tap light. And now that I have some screws in there, I'm going to test the push button, just press it. And then I'm actually going to use that tap light tester again and make sure, again, because it was at a slight angle, right? I'm going to make sure that it still works now that we've put it back together. So I'm going to stick that in the tap light tester. It's a latching push button, so press on to stay on, press to stay off. Looks really good. I'll also test with one of our modified toys. So it goes into the audio jack here, and even though it's a latching, that's fine. Just takes 2 presses to make the toy play the song. So congratulations, you've successfully made a modified push button. If you have any questions or comments, please throw them in the comment section below. Thanks again.